One of the recurring discussions in e-commerce is the ability to deliver goods at an incredibly fast pace, in particularly the last mile delivery challenge. It was Amazon who set the standards for the industry back when they introduced the Amazon Prime with the promise to deliver goods in only 2 days. Amazon's incredibly large network of fulfillment centers allowed sellers to distribute their stock into multiple locations across the country and execute a very fast delivery. Particularly in Europe, though, the FBA service allowed sellers to explore newer markets and expand their customer base beyond their borders. Since then, many companies have been busy building networks capable of competing with Amazon's infrastructure or even outpace it, but most importantly, to allow a borderless fulfillment solution. So today I talked to Bogdan Colceriu. He is the CEO and founder of Frisbo. Frisbo is a fulfillment solution aggregating multiple storage owners and allocating on-demand space to different online retailers. I like to call them the Uber of fulfillment. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Please remember to like and share. My name is Rafael Berti, and this is the Intrepid Sellers. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and I'm here today to talk with Bogdan, directly from Romania. He's the CEO of Frisbo, and yeah, before I say anything about him, I think it's best that he introduce himself. Maybe you want to say your full name, what you do, and what your company does as well.
Okay. Thank you for having me. My name is Bogdan Colceriu. I'm CEO of and founder of Frisbo. Frisbo is a fulfillment company, a logistics company for e-commerce. And what makes Frisbo, let's say special in logistics is the business model, which is different than the classical fulfillment, which means we aggregate different fulfillment resources, warehouses in different countries into one network that we then serve to e-commerce shops via integrations with major e-commerce platforms or major marketplaces. So the typical use case would be a shop owner that would want to fulfill in maybe several markets will use some of our storage spaces to keep stock anywhere they want in Europe, and then link the different sales channels, their e-commerce store, the marketplaces where they are listed, sync that stock and start fulfilling, start selling, and then we would do the fulfillment part, which means pick and pack and deliver to the end customer. We started out in Romania a few years back, then added new fulfillment capacities in the region, going to Bulgaria, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Poland, Germany. This week we're launching UK.
Really? That's awesome.
Yes.
Congrats.
Yeah, and by the end of the year we will be in somewhere in Benelux, Italy, Spain, Portugal. There were some plans to expand east as well, but they are postponed for now.
But that it sounds really great. I think last time we spoke, you were like just a few countries. Now I have seen you expand for a lot more countries this time, and it's going pretty fast. Would you agree with me if I say that Frisbo is like the Uber for fulfillment, order fulfillment?
Yes, that's an easy way to put it, which indeed gives quite a fast picture of what we are doing. Yes, in the sense that we do not own any of this fulfillment capacity. We do not rent the space. We do not hire the people. What we do is we work with local fulfillers in a shared economy model. So yes, in that sense, we are kind of like an Uber of logistics, an Uber of warehousing.
Basically a broker, right? You get the people who owns the fulfillment centers and people who needs a space.
Exactly.
And get them to meet.
Yes, but indeed we own the contract. So basically we do offer the fulfillment service to the online shops, and then we use multiple fulfillers on the ground at the same time for one e-commerce store. I'll give an example. Maybe you want to sell in 5 markets, right? You could actually keep stock in 2 or 3 countries to ensure that you have next day delivery in all of those 5 countries, maybe a return address in all of those 5 countries, these things that make it or break it in the e-commerce industry.
Hmm. Okay, so basically, if I'm located in Denmark, but I
Yeah,
know I have customers in different areas of Europe, I could, in theory, then just hire your services and then break down my stock into different locations depending on where I get most of my orders.
exactly.
Hmm.
And the advantage to that is because you can still do that today, but you will have to go country by country, find a local fulfiller, courier, maybe any kind of service that you need. But difference is you would do it in one contract, one integration.
Hmm.
And then you would use multiple warehouses and you can change them anytime you want. You can test different markets, right?
Hmm.
I mean, maybe your customer base is shifting, is changing to some other area. You can easily move the stock, so you get all this flexibility to use as many stocks as you want. Of course, you need to do it, using your head, because if you really split it too much and you keep stock like everywhere, then the cost of keeping stock will go too high and it will make you less competitive. But then again, many times it's not worth it keeping just one stock and from there fulfilling everywhere, simply because of the time and the cost of that delivery. If it takes you 4 days to deliver and it costs you 10 euros, that's very expensive and a lot of time. You want to take it down to 2 euros and next day. So,
Yeah, so the cost I'm looking at is anything like so there would be a fee for storage, and then there's a fee for sending the goods. Yeah.
yes.
Um.
So, and for the pick and pack part as well. So basically,
Mm.
what we did, we tried to do a very, very simple pricing so that any store can calculate themselves and actually take a month, I don't know, their best month or their worst month, and actually simulate what it would mean if they would have used Frisbo. And so we only charge for cubicle meters and number of SKUs. That's for storage. And
Hmm.
then we charge for the pick and pack process. And of course, then you have the courier cost, right? So these are the only three components that we have in the pricing. There's no other, there's no receiving of goods cost. There's no other typical cost that a logistic operator may ask for.
And since you mentioned it, so the courier costs, the couriers, you guys don't own the fleet. It's
We
also
don't.
working with third party courier companies.
Yes, and typically we work with the known brands, the best courier companies in every country, for which we get rates that normally the online shop would not get themselves.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm curious to, and um, my reference has always been Amazon in terms of logistic,
Yes,
and this, they have an incredible network of warehouse and fulfillment centers, not just in the US but also here in Europe, and they have been working with these third party companies to do the couriers. I mean, but so they own the warehouses, but
yes.
the fleet, they don't necessarily own it, but they do invest in people to, it's unbranded career companies that would like to start, if people want to start a career. And so Amazon has this Amazon DSP program where people can just sign up, and if they have some vans that would like to deliver in a certain area, they compete for those areas, and Amazon kind of give them the startup costs, so kind of finance the
Mhm.
whole business for them as well. I'm assuming you don't have anything similar like this in terms of the careers, but is
No,
is this something that could spark something in the future, or
well,
what's your view on that?
our focus is mainly on the fulfillment services themselves. The courier, mostly in Europe, is pretty well covered by
Mhm.
existing operators. So it's not like a pain that we need to fix. Only in some areas, but there you can always find better operators and you can optimize the process. You can arbitrage between different operators. So there are a lot of things you can do. But the fulfillment itself, especially in Europe, which is a very, very granulated market compared to the US, right? Where,
Mm,
you have one market, you start selling and delivering everywhere. In Europe, you have many markets with different rules, even different currencies if you go to Central Eastern Europe, with different VAT levels. If you keep a stock in one country, you need a VAT. If you sell in one country, you don't need the VAT up until a certain figure, then you need the VAT. So many rules, so complicated, so granulated
mm,
that basically you see that 90% of the online shops are not selling cross border. They are sticking to their own initial market. So even though we are talking about the European Union, where theoretically you can sell everywhere, we are talking of less than 10% of the online shops that actually do that. And the reason for that is not that they don't want to do it, is because it's very complicated to do it, because it's not only granulated in terms of fiscality or in terms of marketing. You need languages, customer support, but it's also granulated in terms of logistics. So you don't have a logistics operator that works in the entire European Union. You do have large logistics networks, but typically they are not for e-commerce. They are not
mm.
e-fulfillment centers. They are more for a second mile or for other types of logistics. So this is the pain that we want to address, and then the focus is how about we make it very easy for sellers to do cross border, to cover multiple markets at the same time, and the couriers themselves, the last mile delivery, you find very good services on the ground that you can use. The fulfillment centers, you find very good fulfillment centers in each country, but you need to put them all together and make one service. So that's where the focus is at this point for us.
You- That's very interesting. You actually touched on a subject that is now very close to my heart, which is the cross-border e-commerce. And I've been talking a lot about this. This is also one of the things that I like to discuss, because I'm totally in favor of businesses reaching out to new audiences, not just the local countries or local markets where they're inserted in, but also many other different markets, because for different reasons. My background is also, I'm an international living abroad. I left my country 15 years ago. I lived in multiple countries. So in my mind, it makes sense to me. Also, my mom is an immigrant. So like in my mind, it makes sense that you go to different locations. Not just, people get curious about your product. Is something unique. If it is something unique, unique in their market at least, they will, it could have a degree of success there automatically. But of course, with every cross border, there are challenges, and it actually amazes me that Europe being so close. I mean, the countries being so close, you have so many differences. Even within the countries, you can find different languages. I mentioned here, for instance, Italy, where I lived. You expect that everyone speak Italian, but that's far from the reality. A lot of people still speak dialects. The elderly people, they don't even speak Italian, which was surprising to me. When I lived there, like I thought everybody spoke Italian here, but that's not true. And even worse with English, they don't speak English either. So, and then I started thinking, like, man, yes, it is. So Europe is, in a sense, is amazing. All this integration that we have with the EU, it really facilitated a lot of things, but there are still challenges when it comes to cross border. And then you mentioned something that it's one of the difficulties is the logistics, but there are also some barriers with the language, culture. But then I have a in that subject, I get a bit of a it's a bit of a chicken in the egg situation for me. People do not want to sell because it's difficult, or is or how do I put this? The the sellers simply don't have the desire to go abroad, or is because they it's really that difficult. They just don't want to be bothered with, so much more in terms of adding people that speak the language, or having because when we talk about a country, the whole marketing as well has to be directed in that language, in their culture as well. We talk a lot about this, um, especially when it comes even English, right? You need to sound like a local. We have customers as well that sometimes they ask, oh, but if I create a listing in English in the UK, wouldn't it work in the US and the campaigns? And the answer is not necessarily, because even though it's the same language, the culture is not the same. So the way they search for the same product, the keywords might not be the same, and the way you talk about, that your product might not be the same. So my question to you is it really, people are just not reaching out really because they it's that difficult, or simply because it's just more comfortable to sell locally? What do you think of this?
Well, it's a good question because I believe the answer is both. Um, and they are very much linked because at one point it's difficult and then it becomes comfortable, to not address that difficulty.
Mm,
And you see it mostly happens I would split the countries in two main categories. There are the fast growing markets, like for instance the Eastern European markets. They grow like 20 to 30% a year. That's
yeah,
hyper growth.
it's
They grow
amazing.
very fast, and that's for the past, I don't know, 5 to 10 years. They've been doing that, right? Because they're very small. They started later, so there's a place to grow. Now, you imagine in a country that grows with 30% a year, there are very few sellers that would think, oh, how can I expand outside of this country? Because that country alone offers them, just by being, I don't know, let's say, relatively passive, it offers them, a two-digit growth year on year. And then you have the very mature markets that grow with one digit a year, right? German market, French market, and so on. So here, then of course, in order for more established, the more mature sellers to actually increase their sales year on year, they would start thinking they would need to go abroad. So from the start, you have these different mentalities. For some, it's very comfortable to stay home. For the others, at least the more competitive ones, it's a challenge that they have. But then when they start to do that, they do discover that maybe they live in the best market they could live, which is very big. I mean, in the German market, because we just talked about it, it's over 80 billion market, e-commerce market, right? The entire Central Eastern European market, it's a quarter of that. So then if you are a seller in an 80 billion market, then when you think, okay, wow, I want to go east because they grow with 30% a year, it's a huge opportunity. Plus, I have very good prices on my product. I'm very competitive there. I just dig in. And then when you go, you discover that, for that market, which is a quarter of the market you come from, there are, I don't know, 8 countries you need to go into. You need
Mm,
to take different VATs, different languages, different currencies, and a different buying culture. And just to give you an example, in Eastern Europe, most of the payments are cash on delivery or payment of delivery, even if it's card, right?
mhm.
They pay when they receive the goods. In Germany, they pay when they buy, which now it seems normal. And it's not like in Eastern Europe they cannot do that, because absolutely every online store offers the possibility to pay as you buy, right? But it's a cultural thing. They got used to paying when the goods received because the couriers offer this service and they offer it very cheap. So it's very affordable, right?
Mhm.
So, and this is a very different culture, right? I mean, even the percentage of returns is different. A lot of things that back to senders are different. They didn't find the guy home. They just take it back. The guy says, "Oh, whatever, I didn't pay for it anyway." So a lot of things may be different because of this. And this is just a small example. There are countries where the habit is that they call every order just to make sure the guy will be there, actually will receive the order and so on. This used to be even in Romania a few years back. So all these things that are different, and then integrations, every country, a different marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now you have a few marketplaces that cover 2 or 3 or more countries, but mostly you have a different marketplace for each country. If you except for Amazon, and then you have the local ones, right? You have C price in France, C discount in France, you have E price in Italy, you have Allegro in Poland, you have eMag in Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria. So you have all these marketplaces that you need to integrate, to sign contracts. You need to choose if you use their fulfillment, you use an independent fulfiller. What do you do? So it becomes a bit complicated. So you really need to get out of your comfort zone to actually do it. And that's why I'm saying it's a combination of both.
Wouldn't you say that maybe marketplaces actually facilitated entering new markets?
There are actually that's what most of their marketplaces are trying to do now. Mm-hmm. Because why? In every market, typically you have a marketplace that grew to maturity, and it's very hard for them to show significant growth year on year, because they are mature, right? They're established in the market. They kind of took everything they can take from that market. We are talking especially markets where Amazon is not present. So it was room for the local marketplace to grow to a very large extent. Mm-hmm. And how can they grow? So they would have to bring outside sellers, because they cannot recruit from their home markets anymore, because they kind of recruited everyone, right? So they need to bring merchants from wherever, China, Germany, UK, US, wherever, right? And for that, they need to facilitate. They need to offer fulfillment services. They need to offer fiscal consultancy, stocking consultancy. And those sellers, they look at 10 markets at the same time, and they don't know too much about each market. They cannot afford to do really a lot of research on the ground to see which is the right product to sell and so on. So you would have to offer this service for them, these analytics and everything. So yes, the marketplaces are doing that. Us as a service, we are doing that. We are facilitating the merchants to move from one country to another through a very easy fulfillment service that that covers everything. We've met in the market consultants that only focus on taxes and on fiscality, where to keep the company, should you have the company here, where to take the VAT, where to keep the where to pay it, and so on. There are agencies that now do localization. We work with a company that basically translates in 14 languages, offers customer care in 14 languages. You need to translate the product catalog, everything basically, right? So all this, and yes, there is a market for this. There is a market for moving sellers across Europe from country to country. And everybody is trying to take a part of to it.
Yeah, it's amazing how much growth we have seen, as you mentioned, in the eastern side of Europe. And you actually mentioned something, like you have Germany, that is such a big market, but at the same time, it's so much competition. And I wonder, won't it be maybe a strategic standpoint as a seller to maybe explore these smaller markets instead of trying Germany, where I would have so many competition? Because in the end, even though it's a bigger market, Germany being a bigger market, I would have to invest more in order to get a return, as opposed to entering Romania, Poland, even though they're smaller. But maybe I'm being the first there, and I'm growing the brand there, and in the future, as the markets mature as well, that could be a potential huge growth for make as much money as I would if I would be entering Germany. Would that make sense?
That is true. It does make sense. It does make sense, and it really is the case. And here you were right before, because here it is kind of the comfort zone. So because there are very few that actually do this analysis when entering the market. It's mostly the top sellers that are looking to go out of their market, to increase sales. But there is a huge opportunity for new sellers, for small medium enterprises in countries like Germany or in the UK, who could easily enter fast growing emerging markets, e-commerce markets, and be extremely competitive, much more competitive than their home market.
Yeah,
but here, indeed, it's a case of also of comfort zone. I mean, it's quite hard.
Yeah, that's that's why I refer back to the chicken and the egg. If it is really, is it because it's difficult to do cross border, or is it really because it's comfortable? People are really not that interested, or they don't see the potential. And when they do, they often want to go to more mature markets. I'm talking in Europe, that would be UK, that would be Germany. But I'm thinking there are many other markets that we could explore, many other countries that would be very interesting. I some years back I have opportunity to talk to some people who have e-commerce in African countries. Now, the view we have on Africa is not a very positive one. In general, is just poverty and people cannot afford anything. But I know many successful sellers that have been doing really well in selling countries like Cameroon, like Kenya, and amazing products as well. And one of them became a millionaire in a matter of weeks because his e-commerce was so good, and because no one else was doing it, but people wanted. So he started with his brother, and then suddenly, uh, their website was booming. And that's the interesting part, is that nobody's looking at those smaller players. They tend to look at the big ones and the big markets. That's where everybody is, so that's where we want to go. I have
There
many
was
clients
this.
from Brazil and they want to go to the US, and I'm like, are you prepared to go to the US? Because US is very nice, it's a great market, no doubt about that, but it's highly competitive. There's a lot of people there.
That's exactly how it is, indeed. And everybody's, going to the same place basically, and wanting to be, in top of the pyramid. But usually, a pyramid is pyramid, so only one can take the top of the pyramid, right? All the others will be below and struggling to get. And then you have all these other markets, which are easy to grab, indeed. But it seems complicated, different language, different people, different culture, some different rules, which when you start studying and when you start actually looking into, and when you start using some of the services that are developed especially to allow you to enter these markets, then you discover it's not that difficult. So once you go out of your comfort zone, basically you do what most of the others do not do. So of course you will take the reward. I mean, it always makes sense, right?
That's my challenge with the Danes here, because I like to provoke, and I tell them, look, the Danes, the Vikings, they used to go everywhere. You guys are only focused in Scandinavia. What happened to the Vikings? To the Viking blood, or that will of going everywhere, explore the world. You're just focusing on your own market.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But talking about that, we talked about a little bit about integration as well. We talked a little bit about Europe. How are things, or how do you have any update with regards the UK since they left? It's been a bit more than a year now since they left the EU, and we had a lot of complications on the border. How is it now, and how is that working for your company? Because you said you're opening UK as well, right? So
Yes.
what's your view on that?
So UK indeed, well, it changed. The Brexit changed everything. I mean, you cannot really send parcel by parcel from UK. I mean, you can, but it becomes complicated. So what most UK sellers are trying to do is either use a merchant of trust in Europe, or simply open a company in Europe and then move some stock to Europe and then fulfill from Europe. So it is an opportunity for fulfillers in Europe. And then is the other way around. It's symmetrical the other way around. If you are a European company, you want to sell to UK, then most probably you will need to use a fulfiller on the ground in UK, use a merchant of trust, or open a company there and start selling in UK. So this changes everything, and that's the reason why we are not only opening the warehouses in UK, but also we need to establish an entity in UK. Otherwise, you always have to do export, import for everything, even the services, right? So it did change. It's let's say it's an opportunity for fulfillers, but it's not the type of opportunity you want to have. It's because it's an opportunity because it's complicated otherwise, right? So
how is it at the border? Is it still very difficult to move goods across? There were some time back we were seeing huge queues and a lot of paperwork. Has that toned down a little bit, or is still complicated?
Well, I'm imagining these things, will ease in time. So typically, putting the stock, the big stock in a warehouse, is not so complicated. Of course, you will need to plan much more in advance, but you do that anyway because in the past year you had supply chain problems all over. So even if you bought your merchandise from China to Europe, you would have the same problem. It would take you much longer time. It would cost you more than it used to be 3 years back. So I mean, we've had clients who are getting their gear for this ski season in March.
Oh,
imagine that as a logistics problem, right? So logistic chain problems are now present all over Europe, not only because of the Brexit with the UK, but because of the entire supply chain all the way to China. And I'm hoping, or I'm thinking, that these things will be solved. But it's clear that we now see sellers adapting to this, making different stock plans, maybe ordering more than they used to, larger stocks, more in advance, planning better. It changes. It definitely changes. So the logistics definitely influences a lot the e-commerce. Market.
So I imagine if I'm an EU seller and I want to sell in the UK, I could use one of your warehouses to allocate part of my stock over there, correct? To do the fulfillment.
And then do the fulfillment from UK to UK for the UK market.
Awesome.
And if you are a UK seller, then normally you would allocate part of the stock somewhere in Europe. It doesn't matter.
Let's
say Benelux somewhere for Western Europe, and Slovakia or something for Eastern Europe, and then fulfill from there.
So my question is, do you have any special policy in place for stock return? Stock that was returned by the consumer and for whatever reason is unsellable, or you cannot sell it anymore? Because and the reason I'm asking that is because obviously the volume is much lower, and in theory that should go back to me as a seller in the EU, but that might not be worth the cost, or is it?
You're right about this. This is a problem actually. So typically what happens is, if the seller is in EU, then normally the returns, they get back, they get not in the initial stock, they get in a separate stock, and that stock at one point gets back to the seller, so they can sort it out and decide what to do with it, what goes back to the supplier, what goes to selling, and what gets destroyed or whatever. Indeed, when it's outside of EU, that is kind of problematic. And typically they would want to look for a solution, any solution, to not have to take it back.
So basically have it destroyed.
Or sell it at very low cost, or or just have it part of some marketing campaigns and give it away. Anything, ideally. But of course, depends from industry to industry, because you might have high value goods and low value goods. But if we're talking about low value goods, fashion and so on, then of course that is the case. They would not want to take it back as much as possible.
Yeah, yeah, that
I
makes
mean,
sense.
even back home, it's a problem, to take it back.
That is
So,
true. That is true.
yeah,
Actually, returns is something that is a metric that you want to keep low as much as we
exactly.
can.
But you
But
know how it is, because
unfortunately,
you have verticals where it's naturally low. It's below
yeah,
1%
and
because that's the type of
the
good.
ones that are very high, like
And
fashion.
then you have fashion where it can go up to 20% easy. And then what do you do?
Precisely, and yeah, that's why I'm asking, because then it would be worth maybe consider what type of product I'm selling
Yeah.
and what kind of returns I could expect, and calculate the cost that as well. So as a seller, I wouldn't just think of my costs and shipping the goods over there and operate from there, but also what would how the returns or the returns rate I could expect in that country, and what cost that would be for me as a seller, and what to do
Yes.
with that.
But
Because we,
here it's an interesting point because actually, if you do a company if you're a UK seller, let's say, and you do open a company in the EU, then you can manage this problem easily because then the return comes to the EU company and the EU company can resell it or do anything. But if you would not open a EU company and you would sell from the UK, so you would export from UK or import into European Union, right? And I would
Mhm.
do the sales straight to you, and you do a return to the fulfiller in EU. That cannot be resold because it needs to get back to UK where it was previously sold from in order to be resold. So it needs to cross the border again, right? Because it was an export, now it needs an import before
Yeah,
another export, right?
yeah.
So they cannot issue a second invoice on that product if it only returned to the local fulfiller in the EU.
Hmm.
You would have a big, a fiscal problem with it because it didn't actually get into your country so that you can actually issue another invoice to sell it.
Hmm.
So this is, I don't know, one example of problems you might have in a in such a situation.
Yeah, I think I heard some time ago that some UK sellers were curbing that issue through Estonia.
Mhm.
Have you heard about that? Is that still going on? Do you know anything
We
about it?
have we have companies that are established in Estonia and sell anywhere in Europe.
Hmm.
Um, Even companies I know that come from more from the east. Estonia is a preferred place, let's say, from outside EU sellers to open a company in Europe. It's mostly because it's digitalized. It's very
Yeah,
easy to do it.
yeah.
So yeah.
But they were, I think that in this case they were using it to curb the VAT. So
Hmm.
they will pay the VAT, but they just wouldn't pay on import.
Yeah.
It's just they will pay later on. It's just a matter to work on their cash flow. I think that's what they were doing. I don't know if that's still possible. Probably not. And if it is, probably won't be for long.
Yeah.
The EU might catch up on that, and then like, okay, now you guys need to work this out. You need to pay up for upfront. But it's just interesting how this situations end up creating so many loops in the loopholes in a system that we as sellers, we just keep on looking for those, because in the end, we need to keep our costs down, and the costs in general for e-commerce, they have increased by quite a bit. When I first started in e-commerce, like more than 10 years ago, the discussions we had were like, is it worth to have an e-commerce in comparison to a retail store, brick and mortar? And a lot of people were in favor of e-commerce, thinking, man, he's just a man behind a computer and some
Mhm.
people running this stuff, the sorry, the inventory.
Yeah.
That's about it, right? As in, when you run a shop, you have to have all the sales assistants.
I do
You have a
remember
lot.
that those were the arguments. Yes, yes.
That was the argument, but
Yeah.
if you think now, with the growth of e-commerce, I would argue that running an e-commerce is, if as costly, if not even more costly than running a brick and mortar store. And I also saw a recent data from I can't remember the website now, but they were showing that this past year, 2021, was the first time in history in the last 10 years since e-commerce started. It was the first time that the retail brick and mortar had a growth uh, bigger than e-commerce, and that's a massive thing. That has a lot to say when you
But if you're
see
referring to 2021, then is it
in
compared
the
to
US.
2020 in the US? But
In
if
the
it's
US,
compared to the previous year, then in the previous year, because of COVID, you had a huge drop in retail. So it
that's
depends
true.
very much. It depends very much what you're comparing it with. But you're right in the sense that yes, 10 years ago, it was a very shallow analysis, like a guy behind the computer versus wow, rent and space and people hired and merchandise on the shelves and so on. And indeed, it's not that because on the internet there is no street you walk on and you just enter stores, right? So you have to acquire each and every client that gets into your store.
Mm.
So
I
that's something.
guess
It was
that
not
was the rationale, because if you refer to brick and mortar stores, you usually would open in a high street with a lot of
yes,
movement in the city center, and that's tend to be quite expensive. You know, if you want to open a shop in Mayfair in London or on Oxford Street, right, where you have a lot of people, it's really expensive per square meter if you need to rent a place. But with the competition on e-commerce, and especially the increase on on marketing, the PPC overall, the cost per click has increased across the board. So if you put this all together, it did, it feels like it became really expensive as well to run an e-commerce, just as much as a retail store.
yes,
So it would be very interesting for us to see in the future what's, if this trend will grow. We're still going through a pandemic that has accelerated e-commerce, but that's an external factor that is boosting e-commerce, and e-commerce in general always has been boosted by external factors. And then again, I'll refer back to when I started in e-commerce. It was out of a economic crisis back in 2008, right? And I don't know if some people know my story, but basically I started in e-commerce because I worked in a retail store, and we just couldn't cope. We were not making enough sales, and we got an invitation from Amazon to start selling on Amazon, and that's basically how I got into e-commerce. So we turned our warehouse into we use one of the small rooms that we had there, spare rooms, and turn into our e-commerce office. And as we started selling, and very quickly our e-commerce sales surpassed the retail stores, and that was a no-brainer for the owner. That was a no-brainer. We need to invest in e-commerce. That's the future. That's where. But then again, we were in a situation where retail, stores were struggling. A lot of people were struggling. So e-commerce was an exit for that. So then again, it was an external factor. We have, fast forward 2019, 2020, we have the COVID pandemic that's also boosted e-commerce. And now, referring back to what we were talking just before we started, we are now there's a war going on between Russia, Ukraine as we speak. Um, this could have a catastrophic um, outcome for everybody if it turns into a nuclear war. Let's hope not. But because of the configuration of the whole thing, you have like China, which is in the heart of the supply chain for a lot of people, a lot of businesses, a lot of brands selling on Amazon US. I think something like 30% of those they're China based. Um, what do you see on this? Do you think? I mean, you're being in Romania. We were just talking about it, that people in Romania are helping the guys in Ukraine, sending supplies. So you're very close to what's going on. I mean, they're your neighboring country. But in general terms, what do you think would be, um, what could this cause to, what would be the impact of this for e-commerce, especially in the logistic and supply chain, if this would affect the world supply in any way?
Well, the countries that are now in conflict, they are not like large suppliers for the e-commerce market, like China is, for instance. Like
Mm,
if China would be in a conflict, directly entered in a conflict, that would change everything, in my opinion. Because here in the region, what I see is, for instance, we have an operation in Moldova. Moldova is a very small country between Romania and Ukraine. Most of the merchandise that is sold online in Moldova comes from Ukraine or from Russia. They are the main suppliers. And now there's no more stock.
mm,
It's completely out of stock. Moldova is now looking at other countries to do their imports, right?
hmm.
So a conflict that would get larger, just take that, what I just said, and multiply it by 100 or 1,000, this problem. And on the other hand, there are companies in Ukraine that are completely blocked. I mean, fashion, e-tailers, and so on. Of course, you could imagine in a situation like this, nobody is ordering anyway any goods other than strictly necessary goods.
Hmm.
But they cannot even open to orient switch to other countries. They cannot get merchandise out of the country. They cannot get merchandise into the country. Only strictly necessary goods are crossing the borders, help or other products. So I don't even want to think too much about it, because if the conflict gets on a much larger scale, then maybe our discussions will not even be about e-commerce. I mean, that would be maybe the
Survival.
least, the least of our problems. And of course, if China gets in any way directly involved, then I mean, even today, China is kind of controlling the supply chain for the entire Europe.
Yeah, very
So
much.
so that would be very hard to imagine that it would not affect.
I think the root of my question is also referring back to, as you mentioned, China is very much involved in the supply chain for many companies and many countries, and they're not exactly partners with Russia, but they do share some common interests. And the fear is really, if China gets involved with what Russia is doing, and I'm referring back to some years back during the Trump administration, where Trump imposed some sanctions on China, and that caused quite some trouble for a lot of sellers, because suddenly you're not
Yes,
just, it was that very difficult to move your goods across and get it from China. And that's basically, what I'm considering, if that would happen. If maybe it's time for everybody to start looking at different locations for sourcing their goods, if possible. Maybe Eastern European countries would be able to do so. I don't know. What do you think of this?
I think a lot of countries and a lot of sellers are already looking for different sources,
Yeah, huh?
and
Hmm.
this is since the events that you were referring to, not only now. Um, what's happening now is different, and it's at a much larger and graver scale than the sanctions imposed by Trump. And indeed, if I remember correctly, then the China's position was that they are partners with Russia, but not allies. Let's hope they
Correct.
stick to that.
Yeah, yeah.
And anyway, I believe that at this point, everybody had enough of a feel of dependency towards the East to start now looking for different suppliers, not only for e-commerce products, but any types of goods, even the most basic of them. And I'm sure that it doesn't matter. So whatever the outcome of this war would be, the markets will change forever. I mean, I mean, forever, for the foreseeable future, in the sense that everybody will try to reduce their dependency on one source.
Mhm. That sounds good. Bogdan, we're running out of time. I just wanted to know if people would like to get in touch with you. Should they just go to frisbo.com? Is that it?
Frisbo.eu, yes,
.eu.
that's the easiest way to get in touch with us. Yes,
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much for today, and
thank
I'll
you,
see you next time.
thank you very much for having me.